The call came at 6:42 a.m. on a freezing Wednesday morning in Minnesota. I was already awake, sitting alone in my kitchen while the coffee maker hummed behind me. Snow drifted past the window in thick, lazy flakes. My phone buzzed on the counter. Mom, we hadn't spoken properly in weeks. Not since the argument about my upcoming surgery. I hesitated, then answered. Daniel, she said, her voice sharp and overly polite. Your surgery is next week, correct? Yes, I replied. I'll be hospitalized for a few days. I told you that. There was a pause just long enough to make my stomach tighten. Well, she continued, your father and I have discussed it, and we won't be able to watch the twins. I thought I'd misheard her. What? It's simply too much, she said. 2 young children. Full time for several days? We're not equipped for that anymore. My hand trembled slightly as I held the phone. Mom, I'm having abdominal surgery. I won't even be able to lift them. You should have planned better, she replied coldly. There are professional caregivers for these situations. Plan better. I swallowed. They're your grandchildren, and that doesn't make us obligated babysitters, she snapped. We raised our children already. Then came the sentence that hit the hardest. Maybe you can ask Laura's family. Laura, my wife, had died 2 years earlier in a car accident. My parents knew that. They knew her parents lived across the country and were dealing with health issues of their own. I felt something break inside my chest. Okay, I said quietly. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask if I was scared. She just said, good, and hung up. I stood there long after the call ended, staring at my dark phone screen. My twins Ethan and Lily, both 5, were still asleep upstairs. They'd already lost their mother. Now their grandparents were refusing them too. That morning, I called the one person who had never failed me. My grandfather. My grandfather, Frank Carter, had always been different from the rest of the family. He didn't talk much, didn't waste words, but when he did speak, people listened. He was 79 years old, a retired Army engineer who had spent decades building bridges and military infrastructure across the Midwest. Strong hands, sharp eyes, and a moral compass that never bent. When I called him that morning, he answered on the second ring. What's wrong, kid? He asked immediately. That was Grandpa Frank. No small talk, no pretending. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it cracked anyway. Can I come see you today? Doors open, he said. I'll put coffee on. The drive to Wisconsin felt longer than usual. Snow covered the highways, the sky heavy and gray. My mind replayed my mother's words again and again. We're not obligated. By the time I pulled into Grandpa's driveway, my chest felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath for hours. He opened the door before I could knock. You look exhausted, he said, stepping aside. Sit. We sat at the same kitchen table where I'd eaten pancakes as a kid, the wood worn smooth by decades of family history. The coffee steamed between us. I told him everything. About the surgery, about the twins, about my parents refusing to help. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't dramatize. I didn't need to. Frank listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly with every sentence. When I finished, the room was quiet except for the ticking wall clock. They said no? He asked. Yes. For medical surgery? Yes. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and stared at the ceiling for a moment. All right, he said. That single word carried more weight than any speech. You're staying here tonight, he added. You look like hell. That evening, he cooked dinner, simple food, nothing fancy. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, the kind of meal that feels like safety. Afterward, we sat in silence for a while. Then he spoke again. Daniel, he said, when your grandmother was sick, I worked double shifts and still came home to take care of her. Not because I had to, because that's what you do for family. I nodded, my throat tight. I've been watching your parents for a long time, he continued. This isn't new behavior. This is just the first time it's affected children. That night, lying in my old childhood bedroom, I barely slept. But for the first time since the phone call with my mother, I didn't feel completely alone. 2 days later, my father called. Your grandfather has requested a family meeting this Saturday, he said stiffly. He says it's important. I glanced at Grandpa Frank, who was sitting across the room, calmly reading the newspaper. What's it about? I asked. He didn't say, my father replied, but he sounded serious. I hung up and looked at Grandpa. They're coming, I said. He folded the newspaper neatly and looked up at me. Good, he replied. It's time everyone remembered what family actually means. Saturday afternoon arrived with a heavy, uncomfortable tension hanging in the air. Grandpa Frank's house, usually warm and calm, felt different that day, like it was holding its breath. My parents arrived first. My mother stepped inside wearing her usual composed smile, the kind she used in public, while my father followed closely behind, his jaw tight. They didn't hug me, just brief nods, like we were distant acquaintances instead of family. Soon after, my aunt and uncle arrived, then two cousins. Everyone sensed something was off. Grandpa Frank didn't call family meetings without a reason. He sat at the head of the living room, cane resting beside his chair, posture straight despite his age. When everyone settled, he cleared his throat. I didn't call you all here for small talk, he said calmly. I called you because I've been doing some thinking. The room went quiet. I'm not getting younger, he continued. And when you reach my age, you start asking yourself hard questions about legacy, about values, about who actually shows up when things get difficult. My mother leaned forward slightly. Dad, is this about your will? Frank looked directly at her. Yes and no. He turned his gaze toward me. Daniel came to me earlier this week, he said. Not to complain, not to ask for money, just to tell me the truth. Silence fell like a weight. These are two children who already lost their mother, Frank said, his voice steady but sharp. And their father asked for help. Temporary help. Medical necessity. My father cleared his throat. Dad, it wasn't personal. We just felt it was too much responsibility at our age. Frank nodded slowly. That's what you told yourselves. He reached for a thick folder on the coffee table and opened it carefully. For Ethan and Lily. The room erupted. What? My mother gasped. That's outrageous, my father snapped, standing halfway out of his chair. Frank raised his hand again. Sit down. They froze. The trust will be managed by Daniel, Frank said. It's designated for the twins' education, healthcare, and future needs. My mother's voice trembled. Dad, you're punishing us. Frank looked at her with quiet disappointment. No, I'm teaching. He leaned forward slightly. You taught your son that family becomes optional when it's inconvenient, he said. I taught mine that family steps in when it matters most. My father's face flushed red. We raised Daniel. We did our part. And Daniel is now raising two children alone, Frank replied. That was your moment to show who you really are. No one spoke. You refused to help for days, Frank finished. So don't act surprised that I'm choosing to protect the ones who actually needed protecting. My parents sat frozen, shock, embarrassment, and disbelief written clearly across their faces. I had never seen them speechless before, and in that moment, I knew something had permanently changed. This wasn't about money, it was about truth. After the family meeting ended, no one knew what to say. My parents left early, stiff and silent, avoiding eye contact as they walked out the door. My aunt and uncle followed soon after, whispering to each other, clearly shaken. The house slowly emptied until it was just Grandpa Frank and me. He exhaled deeply and leaned back in his chair. That needed to be said, he murmured. I nodded, still trying to process everything that had just happened. I hadn't asked him to do any of it. He'd done it because he believed it was right. The week of my surgery arrived faster than I expected. The night before I was scheduled to go into the hospital, Grandpa showed up at my house with a single duffel bag. I'm staying here, he said matter-of-factly. You don't have to, I started. Yes, I do, he replied. And we're not discussing it. He took over without hesitation. He learned the twins' routines, packed their lunches, walked them to the bus stop, and cooked simple dinners. Ethan followed him everywhere, fascinated by his stories. Lily insisted Grandpa read her bedtime stories every night. On the morning of my surgery, Grandpa drove me to the hospital. He helped me check in, waited with me, and sat beside my bed until the nurse told him it was time. You focus on healing, he said quietly. I've got everything else. When I woke up hours later, groggy and in pain, the first thing I saw was Grandpa sitting beside my bed, arms crossed, eyes alert. You're back, he said. Good. Recovery was slow. The pain was real, but I never felt alone. Every day, Grandpa brought me updates about the twins, how Ethan had lost his first tooth, how Lily had insisted on wearing mismatched socks to school, how they both asked when I was coming home. My parents never visited. They didn't call either, but Grandpa came every day. He drove me to physical therapy appointments once I was discharged. He helped me shower when I couldn't stand on my own. He never complained. never made me feel like a burden. One evening, while sitting on the porch watching the sun go down, he spoke softly. Family isn't about titles, he said. It's about responsibility. You don't abandon people when they need you. I nodded, tears slipping down my face. Months later, my strength returned. Life settled into a new routine. Grandpa eventually went back to Wisconsin, but he called every Sunday without fail. 6 months after my surgery, he passed away quietly in his sleep. The call came early in the morning, and even through the grief, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had shown my children what love looks like, and that mattered more than anything else. Grandpa Frank's funeral was held on a quiet fall morning in Wisconsin. The sky was overcast, the air cool and still, as if the world itself understood the weight of the moment. People came from all over, former co-workers, neighbors, veterans he'd served with decades ago. The church was full. Ethan and Lily stood on either side of me, each gripping one of my hands. They wore small black coats, their faces serious in a way no child should have to be. They didn't fully understand death yet, but they understood loss. My parents sat several rows back. They didn't approach us. They didn't speak to the twins. They simply sat there, quiet and distant, like spectators to a life they'd chosen not to be part of. During the service, story after story was shared about Grandpa Frank staying up all night to help a friend rebuild after a fire, about him mentoring young engineers, about how he never turned away someone who needed help. Every story echoed the same truth. He showed up. After the burial, the lawyer met with me privately. The trust Grandpa had set up was airtight. College funds for Ethan and Lily, medical coverage, a safety net that would follow them into adulthood. But the greatest inheritance wasn't financial. It was example. In the weeks that followed, my parents tried to reconnect. Small messages, awkward invitations, apologies that felt carefully measured, like they were still afraid of admitting the full truth. I kept my distance, not out of spite but clarity. They had shown me who they were when it mattered most. One evening, months later, Ethan asked me, "Dad, why did Grandpa help us so much?" I knelt down in front of him and said, "Because that's what love does. It helps without being asked." Lily added quietly, "He never left." "No," I said, "he didn't. We keep Grandpa Frank's photo in our living room. The twins say goodnight to it sometimes before bed. They talk about him like he's still part of our daily lives because in many ways, he is." My parents remain grandparents in name only. There's no bitterness now, just boundaries. What Grandpa taught me will guide how I raise my children. Family isn't blood. It isn't obligation. It isn't convenience. Family is showing up when it's hard, staying when it's uncomfortable, choosing love when no one is watching. My parents made their choice. Grandpa made his. And because of him, my children will grow up knowing exactly what real love looks like.